So continuing on with the Razor Crest series, we now need to set up our render layers. This is going to be far more advanced than what we did in the previous video, and we're going to be using a lot of overrides, and we're also going to be using the VRay material wrapper, which is going to be very useful for us as we set up our different layers. If you have any questions as you're going through this about your specific shot, just let me know in the comments. All right, let's get started. All right, so the next thing that we need to do is set up our render layers and set up our passes. So this is going to be a faster paced part because we've already talked about render layers and we've already talked about passes, but just a quick rundown of what we're going to be doing. I want to be able to separate the sky from the rocks and the ground plane, basically the environment. So I want the sky separate from the rocks because I might want to change the color of the sky. I might want to add clouds to the sky or something like that without having to re-render the rocks. Then I also might want to just change the color of the rocks individually or change the blur of just the rocks. I also want to be able to have the ship completely separate, and I want the dust to be completely separated. So it's very easy to do with render layers, but where this becomes a little bit more interesting is we still need the rocks to cast a shadow and reflect in the ship. So those have to be visible in reflections and visible as shadows, but not visible to the camera. So this is what render layers are going to be even more useful for. A lot of this is going to be review, but we're going to do more with collections this time. And after we set up all our render layers, then we'll do the passes or AOVs. Okay, so let's go to a frame where we can kind of see everything like this. And we'll start off with creating a render layer for the ship. So I'm going to create a new render layer there. Let's type in ship. And then on the ship, we're going to create a new collection. And this is just going to be our ship. And we're going to grab the entire referenced object, the entire hierarchy of the Razor Crest, and add that to our ship render layer. If I select the eye, it's only the ship that is visible. So if I go into the IPR, it's just the ship and also the sky because the sky is going to stay in all of these by default. So if I want to make sure that the sky does not show up, what we need to do, so we need to go to our render settings, go to overrides, environment, and we want to change the background color just on this pass. So we right click, create an absolute override for a visible layer. This automatically add a render settings collection up here. You can select this color value and just say black. If I go back to the IPR now, you can see the sky is going to be black, but we still get the reflections and everything. And then we still have an alpha channel. Got to stop the IPR there. But what we also need to consider is that we still need the reflections of the ground, and we still need the shadows cast by those rocks. So now we're going to create a second collection on the ship, and this time we're going to add in the rocks. And we also need to add the dust in a moment too, but we're just going to start off with the rocks. So we'll add this, adding those rocks right there. So we can just type in rocks. And on the rocks, we don't want them to be visible, but we want them to cast a shadow. And we actually have quite a lot of rock elements here, but Maya's going to take care of all of the primary visibilities at once, because by default, if you create a second collection and then make an override on that collection, it will automatically apply the same override to all elements of that collection if we do it like this. So let's go into any one of these rocks. We'll go into our shape node, and then go into render stats, and we need to turn off primary visibility. So you probably dealt with primary visibility at some point before. In this case, we want to just click the override button for that, and then we want to turn it off. So if we turn this off here, you'll notice that a second collection has been created, and this is all the shape nodes. So this is a transform. So our transform is actually this rock element right here. It's our group. This is called a transform node. And because we are adding an override to a sub-element of that transform, Maya assumes that we want to include all of the sub-elements of that transform, so all of the different rocks, and it's going to apply this little asterisk to the include list, and it's going to apply the primary visibility to everything inside this transform group. So now if I click on any one of these, go to the shape node, you can see the primary visibility on all of these objects has been turned off for this layer. So you don't need to go one by one and create them if you don't want to, because it's a transform and because it's a group. Now for this, if we grabbed the dust and then we also added that to the collection rocks over here, we added that, Notice that the VDB does not automatically get added to that visibility because it's not part of the same group, and we didn't add it at the same time. In this case, we do need to create another override for the VDB. So we're going to right click over this and say create absolute override for visible layer. This will create a second absolute override, it's a different one, and then we'll uncheck that. So if you think that something is overridden and it's not orange, you need to go back and double check that it's actually listed in that collection. If it doesn't show up here, sometimes there's a bug where it doesn't actually highlight orange. But if you click on another node and then go back to it, like if I click the ship, for example, and then I clicked back on the dust, sometimes that will trigger it. I actually haven't seen this bug in Maya 2022, but it was sometimes there in 2020, and it was there in 2019 and 2018 sometimes. But if you ever notice that, just check to make sure that the override is listed in the collection. So I'm going to add the name rocks and dust. Okay, so now what we need to do is go back to the IPR. And I know the position is different here. So this is now this is darker than it was before. If I stop the IPR, and let's say I just delete this entire collection now, so those elements are not in the scene, go back to the IPR, let this render, you can now see this is way brighter. If I A/B these two things, so I can say this is the one that I did, this is now, and this is the previous one, you can see the difference of adding the reflections and the shadows. This is very, very different. This would be much harder to composite if we didn't already have the shadows and the dust reflecting in the ship. In fact, it would be pretty much impossible to get accurate without that information. I'm going to Control Z that just to get my collection back. And now we're good to go on this layer. Okay, let's do that again because that's a little bit confusing. So we'll just do that for the environment this time. Also, before we move on, I just wanted to say, if you go back to the master layer, you should see that these are back on the primary visibility. And if you do a quick render, you should see that the ship with the sky and the dust is visible all together. But we're actually only using that for reference purposes. We're not actually going to be using that for our composite. Okay, so next we're going to create a new layer and we're going to call this environment. Click on the eye for that. We're going to right click, create a collection, and then we're going to go to the rocks and then add the rocks. And we could consider for this adding the dust. And because the dust might be really thick, it would kind of occlude a lot of the light that gets in here. So if we didn't include the dust, we might still be able to composite it so it's close, but then it's not going to match the master scene, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if the whole purpose of what you're trying to do is just separate out all your elements and then recreate the master scene, just like AOVs are used to recreate the beauty, at least until the point that you want to start changing things, well, we would need to add the dust to this in that case. So sometimes it's really easy to have all your render layers completely independent from one another. And if you're going to do like a lot of like customization and do a lot of compositing inside of After Effects or whatever, especially if you are creating your look inside of After Effects. But if you already establish your look in Maya, it's safer just to recreate it in the same way. So I'm going to call this collection Rocks. Then we're going to create a new collection. And then we're going to call this one Dust. And then we'll go down to the Dust VDB. And then we'll add the Dust VDB. Then on the Dust, we're going to go to the VRay Volume Grid, go down to Render Stats. And then we're going to right click over Primary Visibility, create an absolute override, and uncheck it. So it's still going to be casting a shadow on the environment. So if we go to the IPR, it looks a little bit darker. So if I stop the IPR, and then remove the dust, and try this again. So if I A/B this, you can see that there is shadows now from the dust. That probably isn't that important for this, but it is a nice touch and I think it's probably worth it. Sometimes when you separate out render layers, it prevents you from having to re-render it, like re-render the environment, let's say, over and over and over again. This is going to be a little bit tricky to do that though. So for example, let's say that you knew your ship was going to change but you knew the camera was not going to change. Well, you could just render out the environment pass once, and then you could render out the ship layer over and over and over again, and that's the only layer that you have to keep re-rendering. Well, in this case, if the dust changes, you are going to have to re-render out the environment, and we might also need to cast the ship shadow on here, although we could go back to the ship layer and do it there. That actually might be the best thing to do, but for right now, let's just leave that as it is. I think that will be pretty good. Let me Control-Z that to put the dust back. All right, so the next thing that we need to consider is where the ship's shadow is going to go. Now, I don't think, based on the camera angle of my shot, that we'd even see the shadow because there's too many rocks in the way. But if we want, we basically have 3 different ways that we could do this. We could decide to just create a brand new render layer just for the ship's shadow. That would be the easiest solution, but you're going to have to render out another render layer. We could cast the ship's shadow on the environment layer, but if we are happy with the environment and we know the environment is not going to change, then any change that we make to the ship or the animation of the ship would require the environment layer to be rendered out again. So that's a little bit cumbersome. So probably the best solution would be to take the ship render layer, and instead of using the primary visibility on the rocks, we could use a VRay object property node in order to basically still have it not visible, but still receive shadows, but don't affect the alpha channel. So that gets a little bit more confusing. I'm going to show you one way that we might need to change later, but it just depends on the shot. I think we'll be okay with that. So let's try that. All right, so let's grab the ship, which is right here. So we could right click over the environment, create collection, call this ship. So this is another easy solution, but it's probably not the most intelligent way to go about it. But I think for our purposes, it will be okay. I might show you in a later video what to do on the ship layer, but let's just see how this ends up in the composite. We probably will have to go back and change some stuff for the second time that we render this. So keep in mind that we will have to render this at least twice. And usually the first time that we might notice some issues that we didn't think of before. So on the ship, we can select any element of the ship, much like we did with the rocks. And then we can right click over primary visibility, create an absolute override, uncheck it. And once again, because the ship is in a transform, basically has a hierarchy here, it's going to create a collection of shapes. And then on the shapes, it's going to use that wildcard, and every object of the ship has its primary visibility turned off. So let's go to, I'm going to go to a perspective view just so we can look down and see the shadow. Go to IPR and turn off the AB thing here. We don't need that anymore. And now you can see that the ship is now casting a shadow on the environment. So if I lower the camera down, you probably won't even be able to tell from our view, so it's probably not particularly important at all for this. But if your camera angle is looking down on the ship, then it might be a better option to put the ship's shadow on the ship layer. But that's going to require us to remake our ship layer, basically, which let's avoid that right now. Okay, so let's close up the environment, and then let's go to the next layer, which is dust. So I'll make a new layer called dust, click the eye, and for this, we're going to need the dust. Create collection, call that dust, add the dust. So the first thing that we need is the ship, because there's a problem if we just try to render out just the dust as it is. That's because the ship is going to be in the middle of the dust. So if we didn't include the ship's geometry, we'd just be seeing right through the dust, and we'd be seeing parts of the dust that's actually behind the ship. And when we composite the dust on top of the ship in After Effects, we're going to be seeing too much dust, and it's not going to look right. For the ship, let's make a new collection for the ship. And then we'll grab that transform node, add that here. Now, unfortunately for this, we can't just use primary visibility, because that's going to just remove the visibility. And while it would still cast maybe a shadow on parts of the dust, which is fine, but we just want to occlude anything that's behind the ship. Like just don't even render what's behind the ship. That's what we're going to be using. We can use what is called a material override. So instead of having to put on a different material, like manually assign a material to this just for this layer, we can just do that on a collection basis. So we can right click over the collection and then say create material override. So we select that. And then for the override material, we're going to grab something called the VRay material wrapper. So it's VRay material wrapper right here. So basically what the material override is doing, it allows us to coat every object of that collection in the same material. And the material wrapper comes with what's called the matte properties. And the matte properties allow you to either make a surface just a matte object, so it's just completely black, or you can make it matte and also not show up in the alpha channel, which is what we want in this case. So we just basically want the dust to render around where the ship is, but any part of the dust that's actually behind the ship, just don't render it at all. And we don't want the alpha channel to be solid, because if we tried to composite it over it, it would end up being black, which we don't want the dust to be black where the ship is, because that doesn't make any sense. So what we do on this, we click on matte surface, and then we say for the alpha contribution, you say -1. So if I go back to the IPR now, you can see that the ship has been completely cut out of that dust. You can also see the skies here, and we need to go back to the environment and remove the sky as well, which I completely forgot, but we'll need to do that in a moment. But here you can see that the ship is being cut out. And if we go to the alpha channel, the white areas mean the alpha is solid, and the black areas means it's transparent. And we want it to look like this, basically like the ship is being cut out from the smoke. Okay. Now there is one slight annoyance with this, and that is if we have to change the animation of the ship at all, we just change the object of the ship, we change anything about the ship that would affect its silhouette, we have to re-render the dust layer as well. So you do have to keep in mind that render layers are great and they offer a lot of control in post, but changes to them does increase the amount of time that you have to spend rendering. So you do need to think about exactly what you need and if you necessarily need a render layer for it. In this case though, we do. Dust is something that is a lot easier to control in post, and clients sometimes are like, make it slightly darker, make it slightly brighter, make it slightly thicker. Very easy to do that type of stuff in post, and dust can take a long time to render, so it makes sense to do it in a separate render layer for this. Now we do have another problem here, and for this I need to go into probably back to our master scene just so we can show this a little bit more clearly. So we can see all of this dust down here basically, but down here it's just clipping through the floor, the ground plane, which is absolutely not what we want to have happen. So we also need to include the environment plane as a matte object. So you can see this part completely blocks like the ship as it's landing here, but it's also blocking the dust that's clipping through it. So basically we just need to create another material wrapper for all of the rocks. There might be cases though where a material wrapper is not appropriate, or you just can't use a material to override something. In VRay, there's a node called VRay Object Properties. So if you go up to VRay Object Properties, if you add this node, it basically gives you the same type of functionality as the wrapper material, but you're not actually wrapping it in a material. You simply have the option to do your alpha contribution, matte surface, and then on top of that, you also have visibility options for primary visibility that are separated from the render stats one over here. So in this case, we can just go ahead and use the same material wrapper for the entire collection, and that will be more convenient because we can do it on the entire collection. Whereas a VRay object property node, we would have to do it on every single object individually, which is kind of cumbersome. But this is a very useful feature where it offers the same functionality, but then a little bit more than the material wrapper for a lot of use cases. In this case, though, a material wrapper will be more convenient. So on the dust, we can right click, add a new collection, type in rocks. We'll add our rocks again, then right click on that collection, add a material override, And we could have actually done this on the same one as the ship, but it's sometimes useful to have them separated in case you want to do something different on that object, because the environment and the ship are different. Like you might want to do other things with them later on. You might realize you need it to cast shadows or something like that. So in this case, we'll just leave it on a separate collection, even though we're basically adding the same material wrapper. And we're just going to VRay material wrapper, matte surface, take the alpha contribution down to -1. This option here would allow us to cast shadows directly on the ground plane, basically, but we don't really want to do that in this case. We don't necessarily need the shadows to be cast on the environment from the dust, because we have already done that in the environment layer, so you don't want to double up on shadows. Now, if you wanted the environment to be 100% completely removed from anything else except for the environment that you only ever wanted to render once, then both the ship and the dust shadows would have to be on their own layers, or you'd have to make new layers just for the shadows, which is a little bit cumbersome. I think the way that we've done it is going to demonstrate the purpose of render layers and the immense amount of control and customization that you can have. The way that we're doing this is not necessarily the only way to do it. I just wanted to throw that out there. All right, so for the dust, now let's just check to make sure that this is as we expect it. So I'll go back to the dust render layer. I forgot I was not on that one. And then go back to IPR. And now you can see we get the displacement of the ground, but it's also just not showing up in the alpha, which is exactly what we want. You can double check that the alpha channel is looking correct, which it does look correct here. So on that, we are good to go. We also need to remove the sky. So to remove the sky, this is going to be the same thing that we did in one of the previous lectures. Scope to render settings. We'll go to overrides, environment, and then we need to override the background texture color. So we're just going to right click, create an absolute override, and then we'll set this to be black. And then double check that. So now we don't have the sky in there. That looks correct. Just double check that the alpha channel is also looking correct. The only part that should be white is the dust. All right, so next we have to do the same thing on the environment, because I forgot to remove the sky from this one as well. So right click over the background texture, create an absolute override, set the color to black, and then just double check this one worked as well. Every time you start making changes, it's a good idea to run the IPR again just to double check. And I suppose it would be useful to go to a frame where we could actually see the sky, which you can there. So that is now black. Perfect. So then the next thing we need to do is go back to the master layer. Go back to the IPR, and there should still be sky here. If you go back to your master layer and you realize, hey, something's completely disappeared or something's not showing, then you probably accidentally didn't create an override. Okay, so that is the basic setup of what we're going to be using to render these. So when we do the render, we're going to have those 3 layers, and then we also need one for our sky. I can't forget the sky. So the last render layer, we'll just type in sky, and we don't really need to do anything at all on this one. We just need to make sure that only the sky is showing up. So just make sure it's not black. And if it is black, that means you probably didn't create an override and it's black on everything. So just check that. And if it is black on everything, you would want to reattach your VRay Sky to it. So let me just show you that. Let's pretend that you accidentally did that. You broke the connection. You changed the color so it's black on everything. So every layer now it's completely gone. So on the master layer, it's gone as well. You're like, oh no, what did I do? Let's go to the hypershade, and then we want to look for the texture node, I believe, and it's the VRay Sky right there. And we simply middle mouse, click and drag that into the background texture, and that reapplies the connection. So that is pretty simple how you do that. But I can imagine that would be a point of concern if you accidentally did that and you were like, oh no, what did I do? So just to double check that that worked, IPR, you can see, hey, sky's there. Good. On the ship. still no sky, even after reapplying that connection, okay? Because the overrides were already in place. All right, so that is the basic setup, as I said, but now we need to add AOVs to just the ship render layer. We don't want to do AOVs for anything else just yet. All right, so we want to create AOVs specifically for the ship. We might also want to do it for the rocks. It just depends if we feel that that's necessary, but we'll set it up and we'll render it out with AOV set, and then we can extract them later if we need to. Okay, I do want to stress the point that it's not always necessary to render with AOVs, but for the point of this class, it is necessary, so you learn what to do. You should always strive to get as close as you can from Maya or from Blender or whatever DCC you're using. Get it as good as you can, but rendering out AOVs allows you to change a lot of things and just be more creative with it. But it's usually the most important thing to do it on objects that you probably need to change. Like you probably want to be able to change the main subject, for example, which in this case is the ship. The environment you may not need AOVs for. It just depends. In this case, we will need at least the depth for the background, so we will need to do that. All right, so we're going to do this on the ship layer. This is important, so you don't get AOVs on every single layer. Go on to our render elements. So once again, AOVs are the same as render elements and same as render passes, okay? It's all the same name. Render passes in other software is sometimes a very loose term. That's probably why AOVs is very clear and exactly what you mean. Arbitrary output variables. VRay calls them render elements. Just remember all three of those things mean the same thing. All right, so first thing that we're going to do, in order to get this to look correct and match the beauty, we need the following. We need GI. We need lighting. This is going to be our direct lighting. We need to have our reflections, our refractions for the glass. We wouldn't need it, but we do need the glass here. We would need normally self-illumination, but there's nothing on the ship that lights up. If you wanted to add lights to this, it'd be really cool. You would need self-illumination, but for us, we don't need it. We need specular though. We absolutely need those. And then there's going to be some other ones that we haven't talked about. And we're going to start from the top. We're going to go to one called Cryptomat. This is going to be very interesting. I want to show you what this does. Next, we're going to use a denoiser. This is going to speed up render time considerably. Going to make our images less grainy. And then we're going to also do extra text. This is going to be for AO. I'm going to scroll down here, and then we're also going to do Z depth. This is going to be important for adding some depth of field. The Z depth. So these are the new ones that we haven't talked about, and we're going to be using those in a minute. All right, so Cryptomat, let's see what this does. So if we go to Cryptomat and then open up your extra VRay attributes, there's a few things that you might want to be able to change with this. Let's first go to the IPR, let this set up. Now, because we are adding more elements than what is contained in the beauty, for example, Cryptomat, the denoiser, extra text, and Z depth, this will take a little bit longer to render. These really don't take longer to render because they're already being rendered. We're just separating them out into different passes. So technically, yeah, it takes very slightly longer to do, but these definitely take a lot longer, or they could, especially extra text. Right now, this is completely blank, but we will be adding something to that in a moment. All right, so we can stop the IPR now, and then just have a look at what this Cryptomat is. So Cryptomat is pretty interesting, and this is a newer feature in a lot of renderers. And basically, it's going to give you specific elements of whatever it's set to be. So by default, this is node name with hierarchy. There's a lot of different options here. Depending on the renderer, there's going to be even more. Like 3ds Max handles what is called layers, and layers are different to how Maya display layers are basically, but you can stack up your scene in layers and you can do hierarchies based on those. In this case, though, it's going to be pretty simple. Every object is going to be a different color. And this allows you to be able to select specific components of your environment or the ship, and then selectively change how it looks. Like you could selectively change what the engines look like, or the tint, or the color, or whatever. You basically can use all of these as mats to be able to control specific aspects of your scene. So here's a practical use case. Let's say you have a city, and you have all your buildings in one hierarchy, like one group. So they're all selectable on the same thing. Or you can do all your trees, for example. And let's say the trees are too green or something, or like they're just too reflective. You can select all of the trees and control them at once without having to worry about having them on a specific render layer. So sometimes Cryptomat can replace having to have render layers. In this case though, we do need it because we want to be able to change the blur differently. And we want to be able to, I want to just show you this workflow, but Cryptomat is also another workflow that you can use and have everything kind of embedded if you need to. It's very useful, and we might be using that later. All right, so going down the list here, we have what is called the denoiser. So if you go to the denoiser here, you're not really going to see anything that's different. If you go to the RGB color though, you should see that this looks pretty clean. There's not a lot of noise. If I turn off the denoiser here, you might be able to see there's a few areas where it's a little bit grainy, especially in the shadowed areas over here. The denoiser tries to clean that up. There are a few different types of denoising. So there's the default VRay denoiser, which is what we're going to be using. For IPR, it uses what is called the NVIDIA AI denoiser. This one's very, very fast, but the quality is not very good in motion. So there's also a new one called the Intel Open Image Denoiser. I have never used this. It's actually new in the latest version of VRay. We're just going to stick this on the default. IPR though is perfectly cool to have the IPR with the AI denoiser, but we're just going to use for the actual rendered images this. This is going to clean up your image and just make sure it reduces the grain. There's a few options here. You can do a lot, default, strong, custom, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Just leave that on the default settings and everything is good. You'll also notice this thing up here for deep output. After Effects cannot handle deep EXR files at all, but we have to specifically tell VRay to save out deep images. Deep images basically save depth information per pixel, and that's very technical. We're not going to talk about it. I believe Fusion can handle deep compositing, but it's mostly like a nuke thing. It gives you even more control over your scene, but it literally makes like every single file like a gigabyte, like every frame a gigabyte, so it's completely impractical for most use cases. So don't worry about that. If it's on, if it's off, doesn't change anything. Not for us. Okay. So going back to this, extra text. Well, extra text, if we go to that pass here, nothing is here. We still get the alpha, but we're basically coding the entire ship in nothing. All right, so let's change that. So for the extra text, we're going to actually use this for AO. And to change the name of that, so it doesn't say extra texture, basically, we're going to just type in on the explicit channel name, AO for ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion is not part of the beauty. It is not included, usually, unless you're integrating your AO textures or an AO shader as part of your color map, for example, then it would be, and then you would never need to composite AO separately. But we do want to composite it separately in this case, so we're going to create a pass for it. So this does not have to be just for AO. It can be for anything. Let's say you wanted to code everything in some grunge texture, just so you had a little bit more detail and then kind of multiply or overlay that on top of your whole comp. You could do that with this. But for this example, we're just going to use AO. So for the texture, we'll click on the input connection, and VRay calls AO dirt. And that's because you can actually use this dirt shader for a lot more than just AO. You can use it for creating dirt, for example, around like edges and stuff like that. But basically, it's going to be useful for us to create AO from dirt. So instead of calling this dirt, we'll just call that AO. And the default settings are probably okay, but let's go and check out what these look like. Now, if we start up the IPR again, go to AO, this is going to look way too, it's going to look too gray. And if you are ever used to seeing gray AO with sRGB rendering, this would not be acceptable for AO. You would want this to be a lot better, basically. If I switch this back to sRGB, you can kind of see how your AO is looking. And this is what we would consider to be pretty good. But when you're setting up your AO, you might want to just change your display correction back to sRGB, just so you can gauge what the values are a little bit more easily. Then we will need to change this back to OCIO. But because our ACES color space and tone mapper is kind of pushing down all our values so they don't clip, it also affects AO. So in this case, I'm going to switch this temporarily to sRGB and just show you what some of these settings are. So as is, this still looks a little bit too dark in places. So on the fall off, we're actually going to increase that fall off. Maybe something like 4 would be a good value to use. I'll stop the IPR, start this up. For whatever reason, my IPR has been pretty laggy today, so I'm going to keep doing that. And you should see that the shadows are a little bit tighter. The point of AO is to get really tiny, sharp shadows. It is not generally to have like a lot of really large cast shadows. That's what the rest of your lighting and GI is doing. So in this case, we're only really interested in very, very thin shadows. So you could increase your fall off again if you needed to. You could lower your radius to something like 5, for example. And this is highly scene dependent. So if you had this entire scene to scale, these numbers would be very different. So you might notice a little change there. Distribution almost acts as like contrast. So if we increase our distribution to something like 2, you should see a change here as that comes back on. The shadows are even sharper now. And especially over here, we're almost beginning to lose those fine edges. I would say for AO, that's pretty good. There's some shadows that might be a little bit too sharp, but we're never going to composite fully with AO anyway. So this is probably okay. I might try just increasing the fall off just a little bit. Just so that's a little bit cleaner around here. That looks fine, okay? But remember, we're going to set this back to OCIO for the ACES, and it's going to look gray and washed out, but this is fine, okay? This will be usable. All right, so last but not least, we have depth. So depth is going to render the scene with a black and white gradient, and by default, objects that are far from the camera are going to be white, and objects that are closer to the camera are going to be black. So we want to have a nice range of value. So we really need to see everything at once. Now, in order to set this up, we actually need to go back to our master scene here. And when we do that, you can see that all of these are set to off for the master scene. Temporarily, I'm going to turn the Z depth on, and then I'm going to render the entire scene again with that Z depth path being on so we can capture the entire scene because we need this in order to judge the distance for the entire scene. So I'm going to pull this down here, turn this off. And for this, I really need to go to a different view. So I'm going to go to the top view here, right click at the camera, top view, like an orthographic top view. We're going to go to Create, Measure Tools, Distance Tool. And then we're going to select near the camera right there. It's going to add a locator. And then we're going to go all the way to the edge of our scene here. And this will show us in centimeters how large our scene is. So as you can see, this is absolutely minute. This is like a miniature set. It's 81. We really should have made this to scale, and that's my fault for not setting that up at the beginning. But we just got to work with what we have right now. We can't really change it. So 81 is what we're going to be using for our distance. So let's go back to our path. So we'll click on the depth. And this is going to be in centimeters. Well, it's nowhere near 1,000. It's going to be closer to 100. Or you could put in 81, but it's okay to do a little bit more. And if we re-render that, you should see a lot more of the scene come into view now. So this is a lot more useful as depth. The objects that are getting closer to the camera are going to be darker. You could invert that later if you wanted to, and objects that are further away are going to be whiter. Now you could tweak these values even more. So the depth black, you could say the darkest this could go is like 20 or something. If you increase this number here, it's going to be darker further into the shot away from the camera. You can see now the ship is completely black, but in this case, we want that to be 0. For the depth white, I'm actually going to lower that again, maybe something like 90. So we can see that there should be a little bit, it should be a little bit brighter now in the background. You also want to uncheck your depth clamp here. That's going to be pretty important. We don't want to have that. But we're going to do for the depth, we'll just say something like 85, probably good. You usually want to go a little bit more than what the total scene is, just so you have a little bit of clearance. But something like that is going to be pretty good. And as I said, we're going to be using this for what is called depth of field. So as the camera is focusing on the ship is going to be in focus, and the background is going to be very slightly out of focus. And that's something that we can do in post to a certain extent. If it's subtle, we can do it pretty well. and it's going to allow us to change the look of the overall shot. Okay, so we need to make sure that that is working correctly. Make sure you change these settings, because if you don't, then obviously you're not going to get the same result because it starts off at 1000. I don't want the depth to render for the beauty. Actually, I don't need that at all. So if we go back to the ship, all of these are yeses. Now for the environment, if we go to this one, you can see all of these are off for the environment. But we probably want these AOVs for the environment as well. So what we need to do on this, if you simply select these all as yes, because these are not overridden, if we go back to the master layer, now they're all on. So we don't want them on for the sky or the master layer. We only want them for the ship, and we want them for the environment. So on the environment, we have to create overrides for them to be enabled. We go one by one and just enable them all. So create override, set it to be on. Make sure every time that you do this, enabled turns orange, and then it is good to go. On this file name suffix, for AO, I do want to put in AO there. And on this right here, you could just type in AO, just so it's clear, because you might have multiple extra text elements. Want that to be on. And we want that to be on too. Okay, good to go. Cool. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about your specific shot or anything that we've done in this video so far, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video.